The video game industry is one of the largest entertainment mediums in the world. With over $150 billion in revenue, they are larger than the movie and music industry combined. According to a survey by DFC Intelligence, up to 40% of the world's population are active gamers. A large percentage of that are mobile players, but we don't hold that against them. We don't discriminate here. At first glance, it might appear as though the gaming industry involves everyone. With such a mass amount of players, there's much room for inclusion. However, you wouldn't have to dig very far to find some fundamental problems. The term gamer has often been ascribed with toxic, sexist, bigoted. Groundbreaking roles for positive representation of women and members of the queer community are often met with extreme backlash. Whether it's harsh internet commentary or threats of real-world physical violence, positive representation in the gaming community is often met with an extreme level of hostility. Last year, I did a video on the benefits of gaming and the gaming community, but now let's take a moment to focus on the negative. It's important to note, however, that in no way am I calling people who play or enjoy these video games sexist, racist, transphobic, or bigoted in any way. This is simply an analysis of how different portrayals in video games represent the world around us. The first and oldest sign of a lack of diversity in video games is how women are treated. From the moment characters could be included, video games have upheld patriarchal ideas. Classic video games like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda have male characters such as Mario and Link in the lead, rescuing the female characters Princess Peach and Princess Zelda, almost as if they're objects that need to be won. This plays into the damsel in distress archetype, where female characters are in need of a male savior, and are unable to help themselves. While this seems like an arbitrary point, fantasy as a whole has often played into this trope. The popularity of these classic, well-loved video games set the standard for how women are represented throughout video gaming history. Throughout the later half of the 20th century, there was little to no pushback against the hypersexualization and objectification of women in video games. According to a 1998 study by Tracy L. Dietz, only 59% of games with characters at the time had any female characters at all. Out of these, 28% of games portrayed female characters as sexual objects, with 21% depicting explicit gendered violence towards women. This sexualization of women can be found with examples such as GTA or Red Dead Redemption, where the majority of female characters are prostitutes and purely seen as sexual objects. It does make sense from both a narrative and a historical context for there to be sex workers. However, the sheer number of video games that play into this archetype normalizes it in the minds of the players. Even with games that don't directly objectify women, like Resident Evil 3, Tomb Raider, Bayonetta, and Mortal Kombat, there's still an immense amount of sexualization. Despite most of these female characters being powerful and in control of their own fates, they're wearing revealing skin-tight outfits or have unrealistic body proportions. It is also incredibly rare to find women of color in the lead in the late 20th century to early 21st century. And when they were represented in the early days of video games, they often played into this harmful trope that women of color were overly sensual and mysterious. It's also important to note that men can be hypersexualized in video games. Yes, I'm standing up for the men, call me a pick-me, I don't care. Depictions of male characters in games like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter show men as these hyper-buff gods with muscles from their toes to their foreheads. The instance of Thor's character design in God of War Ragnarok just reflects how much media and society looks down on plus-size men. While men also face problems and suffer at the hands of patriarchal ideals and standards, the controversy with gender portrayal in video games lies with the disproportion. There are a small amount of realistic female portrayals in video games, with examples like The Last of Us, Life is Strange, and The Walking Dead. But those are only 3 examples of recently released titles against almost every other title spanning over the course of video game history. The instances of negative and harmful portrayals of women far outweigh those of men, and just reflect how much video games rely on patriarchal ideas. With the negative portrayal of women in video games, it's also not surprising that there's a lack of positive representation of the queer community in the gaming industry. Until very recently, almost every single LGBTQ+ character in video games was portrayed in a negative light. Alfred Ashford from Resident Evil Code Veronica, Poison from Final Fight, and Trevor from GTA 5 all have 2 things in common. All of them are members of the queer community, and all of them are portrayed as either mentally ill and/or a villain. This perpetuates the harmful idea that anything that deviates from heteronormative ideas is evil or dangerous. And it can reinforce homophobic and transphobic views within the player. Even the very notion of going against societal ideas is often treated as a joke. Games such as Final Fantasy VII and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild both have levels where the male protagonists disguise themselves as women in order to enter certain sections of the game's maps. In both instances, the traditionally masculine male characters dressing up as women is often framed as something to be laughed at. It could possibly be understandable with Final Fantasy VII. The game did come out in the 1990s. However, Breath of the Wild was released in 2017. With 3 decades between the release of these two games, there should have been plenty of opportunities to become more inclusive. Even in cases where well-rounded transgender characters are in the lead with The Last of Us 2 and Tell Me Why, the main subject of their narratives focus on queer trauma. Personally, the only times I've ever seen positive queer representation being overlooked is when it's a skippable option for the player that can easily be ignored, with examples like The Elder Scrolls Skyrim or Telltale's The Walking Dead. As previously mentioned, positive representation of gender and sexuality in video games is often met with extreme backlash by a very small but incredibly vocal portion of the community. Whether through online harassment or threats of physical violence, there's a long-standing opposition to representation in the gaming industry. The public's response to The Last of Us 2 is an incredible example of this. The post-apocalyptic The zombie survival game by Naughty Dog is one of the most accessible titles on the market. It's one of the only games that has settings options for players with disabilities such as blindness and deafness. The game portrays well-rounded, fully recognized female characters and members of historically marginalized communities. Despite this groundbreaking game receiving mass amounts of praise, the extremity of the backlash reveals just how toxic some portions of the gaming community can be. The developers, writers, and even actors found themselves on the receiving ends of online harassment and even death threats. Laura Bailey, a prolific voice actor who plays one of the leads in the game, posted screenshots of some of the private messages she had received since the game's release. These messages contained not only threats of violence to her, but to her family, specifically her infant son. This overwhelming hatred of women and minority groups is not only directed at the people who make the games, but at those who play them. Online games such as Overwatch and Call of Duty can be breeding grounds for abuse. Content creator Spontaneous has an entire YouTube playlist dedicated to clips of male players verbally harassing her. The moment players realize that they are competing with a girl, comments start flooding in. The extremities of these remarks range from simple things like "get back into the kitchen" to outright threats of and I can't even say the word. I'm not even allowed to call out I can't even say. While some might try to argue that verbal attacks are just a part of the online gaming community, the jests aimed at women hinge solely around their gender, and not because they're players on the opposite team. When asked about harassment in the online gaming sphere, Aleina Morris, a Twitch streamer that goes by the title of Cozy Little Peach, writes, "A little bit of trash talk is fun sometimes, but when it involves gender, race, or sexuality, it's not okay." This disproportionate treatment of women in video games is not only emotionally and psychologically harmful, it drives them away from a pastime that they love. Morris states, "It's rough to move away from a game that you enjoyed for so long, but I think it was the right decision for me mentally. It's just tiring to deal with toxicity on any gaming platform." This toxicity doesn't end with the games or the people who play them, but sometimes with the very people who make them. Both Ubisoft and Activision Blizzard, two of the largest game development companies, are currently facing accusations of sexual misconduct. Activision Blizzard is currently facing a lawsuit from the California Department of Fair Employment. According to the lawsuit, the studio has a frat boy culture where female employees are constantly denied equal pay despite outperforming their male coworkers. The lawsuit states that some male employees outright ignore women, refusing to talk to them. Women who are nursing reported being kicked out of rooms rooms so that their male coworkers could hold meetings. There are also accounts of male employees getting day drunk and openly making threats towards women. All of these accusations culminated with a female employee's death by while on a company trip. And I can't even say, I'm trying to call out issues here, Susan. What the hell? All of these issues with sexism in the gaming industry call into question what we can do to fix it. One solution lies with providing women with more opportunities for education. According to the American Association of University Women, only 28% of women make up the workforce in careers centered around science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM. They found that parents with more patriarchal mindsets undermine and underestimate their daughters' abilities in schools. There's also a lack of female role models in these career paths. Many people I personally know and massive figures within the gaming industry first got their start with coding and computer science because of their love of video games. So if women and young girls are discouraged from video games and computer science as a whole, of course that disparity is going to be reflected within the community and the industry. While the video game industry has a long history with bigotry and is still burdened by the weight of oppressive mentalities, there's still room for hope. More and more diverse games are being released, and many within the industry are fighting to make sure that representation doesn't just end at the screen, but with those in front and behind it. Organizations such as Girls Who Code are making an effort to encourage young girls to pursue careers in computer sciences, specifically coding and game development. There still needs to be a greater push for positive representation in the gaming industry. The fact that these titles are met with such extreme backlash means that toxic mentality still exists in society and needs to be challenged. People from marginalized groups that have otherwise been ostracized from society need to be given a platform to represent their stories and thrive. And hopefully, if more and more people in the gaming community and industry support them, we will see that positive change.